Once there was an old king who fell sick and thought, "Most likely I am lying on my deathbed." And he said, "Send me faithful Johannes." Faithful Johannes was his favorite servant, so called because he had always been so faithful. When he came to the bedside, the king said, "Dear faithful Johannes, I feel that my end is near. Only one thing weighs on my mind. My son is still at an age when he doesn't know what's best for him. I won't be able to close my eyes in peace unless you promise to teach him everything he needs to know and to be a foster father to him." Faithful Johannes replied, "I'll never desert him. I'll serve him faithfully, even at the cost of my life." The old king said, "Now my mind is at rest, and I can die in peace." And he went on, "After my death, you must show him the whole palace, every room and hall and vault, and all the treasures in them. But you mustn't show him the last room on the long corridor where the portrait of the Princess of the Golden Roof is hidden. If he sees that portrait, he will be overcome with love for her. He will fall into a faint, and later on, he will face great perils for her sake. You must protect him from that." When faithful Johannes had given the king his hand and repeated his promise, the king fell silent, laid his head on his pillow, and died. The old king was buried. Faithful Johannes told the young king what he had promised his father on his deathbed and said, "That promise I will keep. I will be faithful to you as I was to him, though it cost me my life." When the days of mourning had passed, faithful Johannes said to the young king, "Now it is time for you to see your patrimony. The palace is yours now, and I will show it to you." Whereupon he led him all over, upstairs and down, and showed him all the treasures and magnificent rooms. The one door he did not open was the door to the room where the dangerous portrait was hidden. The portrait was placed in such a way that it was the first thing you saw when the door opened, and it was so wonderfully wrought that you couldn't help thinking it lived and breathed, and that nothing in the world could be more gracious and beautiful. Of course, the young king noticed that faithful Johannes always passed one door by, and he said, "Why don't you ever open that door? There's something inside that would frighten you," he answered. The king said, "I've seen the whole palace, and now I want to know what's in that room." He went to the door and tried to open it by force, but faithful Johannes held him back, saying, "I promised your father on his deathbed that I wouldn't let you see what's in that room. It could bring dire misfortune to both you and to me." "I don't believe it," said the young king, "and if I don't go in, I'm sure it will be the end of me. Day and night I shall have no peace until I've seen it. And now I mean to stand here until you open that door." Faithful Johannes saw there was no help for it. His heart was heavy, and he sighed mournfully as he took the key from the big bunch. He opened the door and went in first, thinking he could cover the portrait with his body so the king wouldn't see it. Much good it did him. The king stood up on tiptoes and looked over his shoulder. When he saw the portrait of the maiden, so beautiful and so resplendent with gold and jewels, he fell to the ground in a faint. Faithful Johannes lifted him up and carried him to his bed. "Now it has happened. Good God, what will be the end of it?" Then he restored the young king with wine, and soon he was himself again. The first words he spoke were, "Ah, what a beautiful portrait! Who is it?" "It is the Princess of the Golden Roof," said faithful Johannes, and the king said, "My love for her is so great that if all the leaves on the trees were tongues, they couldn't describe it. I'll stake my life to win her. You are my dear faithful Johannes. You must help me." For a long while the faithful servant pondered. How should they go about it? For even to approach the princess was no easy matter. When at last he had thought of a way, he said to the king, "All her chairs, tables, bowls, cups, and dishes, everything she keeps around her is gold. There are 5 casks of gold in your treasure house. Have the goldsmiths of the kingdom work one of them into all manner of vessels and implements, into birds, beasts, and miraculous creatures. Such things will please her. We shall sail to her country and try our luck with them." The king sent for all the goldsmiths, and they had to work day and night until at last the marvelous things were ready. When they had all been loaded on board a ship, faithful Johannes dressed up as a merchant, and the king had to do likewise to make himself unrecognizable. Then they put out to sea and sailed until they reached the city where the princess of the golden roof lived. Faithful Johannes told the king to stay on board and wait for him. "Maybe I'll bring the princess back with me," he said, "so take care and put everything in order. Have them set out the golden vessels and adorn the whole ship with them." Then he gathered all manner of golden things into his apron and went straight to the royal palace. When he entered the courtyard, a beautiful girl was standing by the well. She had 2 golden buckets and was drawing water. As she turned and made ready to carry the glittering water away, she saw the stranger and asked him who he was. "I am a merchant," he replied, and he opened his apron and let her look. "My, what beautiful things!" She put down her buckets and examined them one by one and said, "The princess must see them. She's so fond of gold work, I'm sure she'll buy them all." She took him by the hand and led him into the palace, for she was the princess's maid-in-waiting. When the princess saw the things, she was delighted and said, "They're so beautifully made, I'd like to buy them all." But faithful Johannes said, "I'm only the servant of a rich merchant. What I have here is nothing to what my master has on his ship. Nothing more artful and charming has ever been made of gold." She wanted to have it all brought to her, but he said, "There's so much, to have it all, it would take days to move it. There aren't enough rooms in your palace to show it in." Her curiosity and eagerness grew so great that she finally said, "Take me to the ship. I'll go there myself to see your master's treasures." Faithful Johannes led her to the ship. He was very happy. When the king caught sight of her, he saw that she was even more beautiful than her portrait, and he thought his heart would burst. She went aboard, and the king led her inside the ship. But faithful Johannes remained on deck and told the helmsman to cast off. "Unfurl the sails, make the ship fly like the bird on the air." Meanwhile, the king showed her the golden vessels one by one, the bowls and cups and dishes, the birds and beasts and fantastic animals. Hours passed while she was looking at them from all sides, and in her joy, she didn't notice that the ship was moving. After examining the last piece, she thanked the merchant and decided to go home. But when she stepped out on deck, she saw that the ship was far from shore, speeding over the high seas with all the sails unfurled. "Oh," she cried in horror, "I've been deceived and carried away. I've fallen into the hands of a merchant. I'd sooner die." But the king took her by the hand and said, "I'm not a merchant. I am a king, every bit as well born as you. If I've carried you off by treachery, it's because I was overpowered by love. When I first saw your portrait, I fell to the ground in a faint." At that, the princess of the golden roof was comforted. Her heart spoke in his favor, and she gladly consented to become his wife. But while they were on the high seas, it so happened that faithful Johannes, who was sitting in the bow of the ship playing a tune, saw 3 ravens come flying through the air. He stopped playing and listened to their conversation, for he knew their language. One of them cried out, "Look, he's taking the princess of the golden roof home with him." "So he is," said the second, "but he hasn't got her yet." "What do you mean he hasn't got her?" cried the third. "He's got her right there in his ship." The first spoke again and said, "A lot of good that will do him. When they go ashore, a chestnut horse will come running toward him. He'll want to jump on its back. And if he does, it will fly away with him, and he'll never see his princess again." The second spoke, "Is there no way of saving him?" "Oh yes, if someone else jumps on quickly, grabs the pistol that's sure to be in the saddle holster and shoots the horse dead, then the young king will be saved. But who knows that? And if anyone knows and tells him, he'll be turned to stone from the tips of his toes to his knees." Then the second raven said, "Well, I know still more. Even if the horse is killed, the young king won't be able to keep his bride. When they reach the palace together, he will see a bridal robe laid out in a basin. It will seem to be woven of gold and silver, but it will really be made of sulfur and pitch. And if he puts it on, it will burn him to the marrow. The third asked, "Is there no way of saving him?" "Oh, yes," said the second. "If someone picks up the robe with gloves and throws it in the fire and burns it up, then the king will be saved. But what's the good of that? If anyone knows and tells him, half his body will be turned to stone, from his knees to his heart." Then the third said, "Well, I know still more. Even if the bridal robe is burned, and the young king won't keep his bride. After the wedding there will be a ball. While the young queen is dancing, she will suddenly turn pale and fall as though dead. Unless someone lifts her up and sucks 3 drops of blood from her right breast and spits them out, she will die. But if someone knows it and tells, his whole body, from the top of his head to the tips of his toes, will turn to stone." When the ravens had said all that, they flew away. Faithful Johannes had understood every word. From that time on, he was silent and sad, because if he didn't tell his master what he had heard, his master would come to grief, and if he did tell him, he would be forfeiting his own life. In the end, he said to himself, "I will save my master, even if I have to die for it." When they went ashore, it so happened that what the ravens had predicted came true. A magnificent chestnut horse came galloping toward the king. "Look," cried the king, "this horse shall carry me to my palace." He was just about to mount the horse, but faithful Johannes was too quick for him. He swung himself into the saddle, drew the pistol from the holster, and shot the horse dead. But the king's other servants, who bore faithful Johannes no love, cried out, "What a shame to kill that beautiful beast, which was going to carry the king to his palace." But the king said, "Be still and let him go. He is my dear, faithful Johannes. Who knows what good may come of it?" When they went into the palace, there was a basin in the great hall, and in it lay the bridal robe, looking as if it were made of gold and silver. The young king went over and was going to take hold of it, but faithful Johannes pushed him away, picked it up with gloves, hurried to the fire, and burned it. Again, the other servants began to grumble, saying, "What do you think of that? Now he's gone and burned the king's bridal robe." But the young king said, "Who knows what good may come of it? Leave him alone. He is my dear, faithful Johannes." The king and the princess were married. The dancing began and the bride joined in. Faithful Johannes was watchful and kept looking at her face. Suddenly she turned pale and fell to the floor as though dead. He leaped to the spot, picked her up, and carried her to the bedchamber. As she lay on the bed, he knelt down, sucked the 3 drops of blood from her right breast, and spat them out. Before you know it, she began to breathe and come to herself. But the young king had seen what had happened, and he was angry because he didn't know why faithful Johannes had done it. "Throw him into prison," he cried. The next morning, faithful Johannes was condemned to death and taken to the gallows. As he stood there on the scaffold, he said, "Every condemned man is allowed to speak up before he dies. Shall I too be granted that right?" "Yes," said the king, "it is granted." Then faithful Johannes said, "I have been condemned unjustly. I have always been faithful to you." And he told the story, how he had heard the conversation of the ravens on the high seas, and had to do all those things to save his master. At that the king cried, "Oh, my dear, faithful Johannes, forgive me, bring him down." But no sooner had faithful Johannes said his last word than he fell lifeless and turned to stone. The king and queen were very sad, and the king said, "Alas, how faithful he was, and how ill I rewarded him." And he gave orders that the stone statue should be carried to his bedchamber and placed beside his bed. Every time he looked at it, he wept and said, "Oh, if only I could bring you back to life, my dear, faithful Johannes." Time passed, and the queen gave birth to 2 twin sons who throve and were a great joy to her. Once, when the queen was at church and the 2 children were playing with their father, he looked at the stone statue and his heart was full of grief. He cried out, "Oh, if only I could bring you back to life, my dear, faithful Johannes." And the stone began to speak and said, "You can bring me back to life, but you must sacrifice what you love most in this world." The king cried out, "For you I will give everything I have." The stone spoke again. If with your own hand you cut both your children's heads off and dab me with their blood, I shall come back to life." The king was horrified when he heard that he would have to kill his beloved children. But remembering how faithful Johannes had been and how he had died for him, he drew his sword and cut the children's heads off with his own hand. When he had daubed the stone with blood, it came back to life, and faithful Johannes stood before him hale and hearty. He said to the king, "Your fidelity shall not go unrewarded." And he took the children's heads and set them in place. He daubed the wounds with their blood, and in an instant they were whole again, jumping about and playing as though nothing had happened to them. The king was overjoyed, and when he saw the queen coming, he hid faithful Johannes and the two children in a big cupboard. As she entered the room, he said to her, "Did you pray when you were in church?" "Yes," she said, "but I kept thinking of faithful Johannes and the terrible misfortune that came to him on our account." He replied, "Dear wife, we can bring him back to life, but it will cost us our 2 sons. We shall have to sacrifice them." The queen grew pale and horror gripped her heart. "But," she said, "we owe it to him for being so faithful." Delighted to hear that she felt the same as he had, he went and opened the cupboard. Out stepped the children and faithful Johannes, and the king said, "God be praised, he is saved, and we have our sons again too." And he told her how it all had come about. After that, they lived happily to the end of their lives.